Welcome to this afternoon's session, From Pandemic Pivot to Exit. We're going to discuss how independent schools responded to lockdowns and pivoted during the pandemic, and how all schools can learn from independent schools' experience. We have a fabulous panel of experts with us this afternoon. First, I'll introduce Dr. Deanie Van Pelt. Deanie is the president of Advance. She's known to many of you. She's, of course, a longtime senior fellow. So Deanie, welcome. Our second panelist is Amanda Dervades. Amanda is very, very interesting because she's not only the executive director of the Ontario Federation of Independent Schools. Welcome, Deanie. But Amanda, she's, how I like to say, she's in the trenches. She's experienced what the pandemic schooling has been like for the last year and a half, actually as a principal, as a teacher, while being the executive director of the largest independent school association in Ontario. So Amanda, welcome. Great to have you. And our third panelist, Dr. Derek Ellison, who of course is Professor Emeritus, the Faculty of Education at the University of Western Ontario. And Derek, I think there's few scholars who I've cited more and who I've learned more from. So thank you for being here. I hope that in a small way even, that I can build on your work. You've been a tremendous impact on me and the work of Cardus. So thank you for being here. All three of our panelists are truly excellent. So how this session is going to go down, it's a short, lightning fast, as I like to say, 45 minutes. It's going to be packed. If you're in the audience, you're going to want to put on your seatbelt. We got a lot to cover. There's a little icon on the bottom. It says Q&A. So as you have questions, jot your questions down. The last time we did a webinar like this, I think we had 2 pages worth of questions we didn't have time to get to. So get in early, get your questions in as they come up. We'll do our best to get to them. What we're going to do is about 10-minute presentation from Deanie looking at our most recent research findings. Then we'll have a discussion, and then we'll open up to the Q&A. So get your questions in as they come up, and I'm going to pass it over to Deanie so we can dive right into the presentation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you to Cardus as well for hosting this session. It's an honor to be with these panelists here today. And thank you to each one of you that's taken time. Where I am, it's a gorgeous, beautiful spring day. Thank you for taking time to gather around this question. And that's exactly where I want to start. I want to start at the end with a big question. And this is the question that I hope that each one of us will be engaged in throughout, listening to the brief summary of findings that I'll share, that Cardus released today, a study that they released today. But then I hope that we leave still asking this question. And it's this: what conditions are needed such that more, if not all, students within all systems are able to thrive and flourish, whether in times of stability or in times of crisis? So we're going to drill down and get some first answers to that from a small population of independent schools that I believe may have some wider application to this question. The first slide, please. So as I said, we released a new study today. It's based on data that were gathered June 2020, 3 months into the pandemic. Buildings were ordered shut on March 12, 2020 here in Ontario, and it was similar across the country, and they did not reopen again in June. We interviewed principals of 84 Advance affiliate schools, and these are some of the initial gleanings. So first of all, we found that students in these schools, 48% of them did not miss a single day of instruction following March break. So to be clear, shutdowns were ordered just before March break. Teachers canceled or returned from their March break, began preparing, pivoted, and half of the schools missed not a single day of instruction. Taken all together, 84% of the schools missed no more than 3 days of instruction during the turnaround from in-person to remote or distance learning. We found as well that the students on average received double the government guideline time for instruction. So when the government finally did come out with guidelines on how many hours of instruction students should receive throughout their school day during the shutdown, the building shutdown, students in independent schools in this sector were receiving double that required amount. Next slide, please. Let's remind ourselves, next slide, please. Let's remind ourselves of the context. Ontario has the largest independent school sector of any province in Canada. It educates over 150,000 students. That's 1 of every 14 students in the province of Ontario attends an independent school. There are now over 1,500 independent schools in Ontario. The number grows year by year by year, and last year, or this current school year, is no exception. It is the case that 1 in 4 schools in this province is an independent school. The survey that we sent out to Advanced Affiliate Schools went to 84 schools, all of the affiliates. 85% of them responded. So in other words, the results you're hearing come from the full population of independent Christian schools affiliated with Advance. This sector educates 10% of the students that attend independent schools in the province, or 15,000 students. Our question is, do the findings of this study apply beyond just the population that we considered? So let's take a look. One more slide about context and methodology for the survey. It did go to principals, as I said, they had 1 week to complete it. We had we had 85% participation rate. 75% of the schools surveyed were elementary schools, you'll see on the left of your screen, and the other quarter were either secondary schools or JK to 12. The phenomenon of combined schools is quite unique, and it's much more prevalent, as you may well know, in the independent school sector. We must, in my opinion, pay attention to school size. Notice that 94% of schools had 400 or fewer students. We are considering results found in small schools, what the literature would call small schools. In fact, take a closer look. 61% of the schools had fewer than 200 students. I think that's worth noting as we talk about the conditions that are necessary for students to thrive. So that's it for context. Lots more in the study, which you can download if you haven't already at the end of this presentation. So what did we find? A few key findings. Next slide, please. Instruction. Let's look at the slide on the right. We did find this shows the hours per day in remote learning. Most of it, or much of it, was synchronous with the teacher present, but it was the principal's assessment of the hours of remote learning that occurred per day by grade. It went up, as you can well see, and as we said, it was double what was the guideline by government. Look over on the left, though. 42% of the schools said that they were extremely prepared or prepared. Remember, when we switched to building closures to virtual learning, that was under emergency conditions. Even then, these independent schools felt in some way prepared. 2 out of every 5 schools. Notice that about a quarter said they weren't prepared, but also very interesting and important to notice, 30% felt completely unprepared. And yet, in that 1 week, when most others were on vacation, they were doing the pivot. So from unprepared to suddenly remote delivery. I think that's an important contextual item. Another very important finding, in my opinion, next slide, please, has to do with special education. 97% of the schools do offer some sort of student support services. Sometimes we call them special education services. It's interesting to note that 88% of them continued to offer student support services. So 22% offered even more student support services, 28% continued with the same level that they would have for in-person instruction. And then 38% said they had a decreased level of support, but they still continued their special education or their student support services. This says something about no student being left out of the pivot to remote instruction. The next slide gives an indicator, in my opinion, to the role of the school leader. Take a look at the first 3 bars. Principals became very busy working with their staff and their students. Their communications are an indicator of that. They spent the majority of their communication time during emergency communicating to families, to parents, to their instructional staff, and with students. Notice that other staff, non-instructional staff, donors, support community, the broader external voices, they communicated with them, but it was not a place of priority. I think that the way that principals redirected their attention and communication activities during time of crisis gives us some sort of insight about what it means to offer a flourishing educational environment in time of crisis. And I think there's a lot to unpack there. But we're going to leave that and we're going to move to one more key indicator, in my opinion. That's in the next slide. School community and culture means an enormous amount in these schools, as we know. And I believe that the plans for graduation and the plans for celebrating learning, celebrating the students, the community coming together at the end of the school year is a key indicator of that cultural, the warm culture and the community. 0 schools canceled their graduation ceremonies or their celebrations of learning. They all found a way last year during building closures to offer some kind of hybrid, virtual, or pushed to the future way to celebrate with their community at the end of the school year. Again, I think this gets at what are the key components to a thriving school. And in my last few moments here, I think we do have to talk about finances. Let's take a look at the next slide. As you know, independent schools in Ontario receive no provincial government funding. About 2/3 of them did take advantage of some of the federal funding programs we found with this study, but no provincial funding for any of the costs associated with operating during a pandemic. So notice the attention to expenditure control. 77% of the schools surveyed laid off staff members. Most were non-instructional, but nevertheless, with a diminished amount of staff, they were able to achieve some of the results that I have shared with you today. In fact, and look at the pie chart on your left, 83% of the schools even offered some sort of emergency tuition relief to families. Many schools, if not all, made a commitment that no family would have to leave for financial reasons during this emergency time. These were unexpected financial accommodations that the schools had to make, diminishing even further than their revenues. So there's something about the finances and the financial structure as well of these schools that's important to remember. These are middle-class families. The schools educate at a cost of about $9,000 per student. So it isn't wealth and it isn't necessarily enormous expenditures per child on education that explains the success during this crisis. And my last slide. Going forward, we asked the principals to reflect. Would anything change in the future? And the simple answer is yes. In almost no cases did we see schools saying, we are just going to go back to delivering instruction, delivering education in the way that we used to. We will incorporate some kind of remote learning with our face-to-face instruction, or we may even come up with a brand new hybrid model of delivery. We will make other technological investments. So this shows that even though there was a measure of success in the first 3 months during the most difficult months of the transition, there was a looking forward and knowing that education would never be the same as we emerge from COVID. We asked principals to tell us stories, to reflect and to share something positive that has happened in the past 3 months. And we as researchers, when we were going through those stories, were absolutely flabbergasted to hear three things emerge. The teachers were the heroes. This success pivoted on the teachers. Secondly, the communities collaborated in healthy ways. They didn't take a lot of the principals' time, but they came around. Checks showed up unasked because the support community in some cases just knew that help would be needed. There were many other ways that the community came around. Boards of directors that were ordinarily much more governance oriented became more operational. Read the report to have your heart warmed with 4 or 5 pages of how the teachers and the community came through. But perhaps even most importantly are the stories of students that thrived. Some students that didn't do well in ordinary face-to-face classroom time thrived with the new structures. And what happened is the student was not left on their own. The culture did surround them. The teachers, the community surrounded them, but in some way, the students now became agents of their own learning. They took more ownership for their own education. And I think that there's something here from these stories that the principals told that we can all learn about effective education going forward. So I end now with the question with which I began. What conditions are necessary if we are going to set up systems of education where all students can thrive, whether we're in times of stability or times of crisis? I think I've hinted at 4 areas. We need educators with capacity to contribute whatever it takes. We need community collaboration in a community that surrounds a school. We need students to be at the center of what we do. They need to own and be agents of their own learning. And finally, we need to structure our schools so that principals can lead, not merely administer, but can lead autonomous schools that are accountable to their community, to the government, and to the wider public. Thank you.
So expanding on that, Amanda, if I could welcome you back, Derek, if I could welcome you back. So expanding on those findings, of course, Amanda, you were in the trenches for what's it been, like 1.5 years of pandemic schooling. So of those findings, I'll start with you, Amanda. Of the findings that Deanie presented, how much of that resonates with your sector within the independent school space? And I guess, yeah, what was the biggest thing you learned? What stands out from that is true across the board?
I would say all of it resonates, and it is completely in line with my own personal experience in my school and with working closely with the almost 100 independent schools across Ontario, and exactly the key things that you picked up on, Deanie. So, before even reading the report, all of my notes when reflecting back and looking at what was going on in the OFIS schools, we're looking at, for sure, agency, that sense of agency, and from all players in the community. So the leaders, the teachers, the students, and the parent community, and the size as well was a real factor. And of course, the size was very closely related to that sense of community and that ability to connect, to collaborate, to work together, and to support each other, without a doubt. Again, that sense really closely tied into to community, the commitment of all of the players, that everyone was so invested and involved. And of course, these are all interwoven, right? It's that sense of agency, feeling valued in the community, being able to work together, and to want to show up and to come up with solutions, to work together. So all of those. One thing I would add too was that the sense of it was a crisis. It was chaos. It was scary. There was so much uncertainty, but that also offered an opportunity for innovation. There was I don't want to say excitement, but that all of a sudden that opportunity to, okay, go, let's move on this. all of those things that we're trying to teach so desperately, right? It seems we talk about all the 21st century skills. It almost seems cliche now, right? That when we say it and we run down that list, and then here it is, the epitome of the, that opportunity, that circumstance that, we're not talking about something in the future of, all of these things that you have to be prepared for. It's right here, right now. And let's move, like it's go time. And I think in our independent schools, with all of those factors that you listed, we had the opportunity to do that. So let's collaborate. Let's, identify that problem and start working together to come up with creative solutions. And, and then with that, you saw all of the adaptability, the flexibility, the resilience, all of these things that, all these skills that we know.
So on exactly that note, Amanda, if I'll stick with you just for a minute longer. So Dean looked at some stuff that seemed to be permanent as principals looked forward. They said, what innovations are here to stay? So from your perspective, what schools was completely disrupted, everything changed, the entire way we do schooling changed. What, in your opinion, will be permanent moving forward, Amanda?
Well, with the online, I agree that the incorporating the technology will definitely be a factor. Just because we were thrust into it, we had this, a really quick, just being thrown in. We had this opportunity to learn fast, fail fast, see what worked, what didn't, realize the limits of technology and where we needed more, where we needed the investments. So I think that was a great opportunity to, I think it fast tracked us into effective technology use for online learning. And I say online learning, but I usually make the distinction between online learning and virtual classrooms, which I think are two very, very different things. But for sure, and I think that also recognizing the need to be nimble and responsive and flexible. So anything from the furniture we purchase, let's say, that may be, that consideration for, having less permanence in some of these investments. I think that there's lots to consider there in addition to into the technology. So just how we operate and how we make decisions for our schools.
Very good. So moving beyond just the independent school space, Derek, if I could pull you in here, how do we take these findings and say how can all schools learn from this experience and the swiftness and the agility of the independent school response?
The short answer to that is I don't think they can. The reason for that is because we have different kinds of schools. And the big division is between the public school and the independent school. And as I will talk, I hope at some length, later on in the seminar about, those differences are substantial, and they create very difficult barriers to realizing the kind of change, the kind of coping, the kind of responsiveness that we saw documented in this study. And we have to agree, I think, I would hope that everybody attending the seminar would agree that the results are really quite amazing in many respects. And I would like to add that they're not unique. The study that Cardus conducted and that Ginny reported here piggybacked down a previous study by an American group, Associated Christian Schools International. And the general tenor and tone and direction of the findings in that study were very similar, if not identical in some respects, to those in this study. So this isn't a flash in the pan. This is not something unique and random. We have reason to believe, as Amanda was also saying, that there are very common and very important threads here. But I would like to stress, and hopefully I will get to bore you a bit further with this later on, that many of these features are embedded in the nature and characteristics and strengths of independent schools particularly. Now, I think we have to take notice also that this study and the one it was it was based on in the States, focused on Christian schools in particular, only Christian schools. Now, I think that's important. I think certain aspects of community life and community commitment and a sense of common purpose and identity figure prominently in the processes that were reported in the study, that were documented in the study. This shines through particularly in the comments of the principals toward the end of the study that were documented. Really, really very, very impressive. There's a great deal of mutual respect, mutual acceptance, and community commitment. The events reported in the study wouldn't have happened without those. And we have to keep our minds open to the importance of the shared identity with the Christian faith amongst the participants and the degree to which this contributed. I'm not saying it's by no means the sole explanation, but I think it may have amplified, it may have helped the ability of the schools to be so agile in response of this terrible, unexpected series of challenges, and to respond so appropriately within the educational sphere. Don't forget the great things that Dini documented there, the small loss of instructional time and the breadth of coverage. These are focusing upon educational content rather than more mechanical ways of coping with the problem. And the bottom line point here is that the study also documents, there's a particular quote which I think is important here, how satisfying the responses of the schools were to the school participants, to the parents, to the students, to the supporters, to the teachers, all those involved in making these responses successful were also satisfied with the outcomes. Now, I don't think you're going to find many parents in Ontario or the rest of Canada today that are very satisfied with the way in which non-independent schools manage to cope with the crisis.
Okay, so then do we then jump ahead then right away? So then what needs to be done then, Derek?
Well, this is my big question. I've prepared a little talk on this. I'm willing to launch into it now, but the agenda.
Sure. Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
Until later. So you would like me to give you my talk now?
Sure.
All righty. So I've got to change hats now. I got to put on my professorial hat, and I'm going to follow my notes. In response to the question of how we can make all schools more nimble, responsive, and community-based, we have to start out by recognizing that the notion of all schools is a problem which needs some unpacking. Now, the key points I'm going to mention are going to be familiar, but I think they need to be appreciated in a different light. In Ontario, Canada, and the US, we currently have two different kinds of child and youth enrolling schools that are so different as to almost constitute separate species. These are, of course, public schools and independent schools. Now, the chief pertinent characteristic of what we call public, but perhaps we should more accurately call state or government schools, is that they are inseparable parts of very large, often massive, bureaucratic organizations which govern, direct, and regulate how they operate. Now, we commonly call the most immediate of these largest systems school boards, a term which simultaneously refers to both the set of publicly funded, rule-regulated schools distributed across a region, together with their administrative and support systems, and number two, the single body of elected trustees representing many, often many, sometimes many parents and resident taxpayers in the area, and which govern the schools and their related systems. We might say, quoting from somewhere else, one ring to rule them all. Independent schools are standalone schools, operating independently of a superordinate administrative and governing system. They are obviously subject to provincial laws and regulations, constraining how they function and what they can do, but they have much greater operational independence, especially in Ontario, where there are minimal operational requirements for independent schools. They almost always have, always in the case of the schools in the study, they almost always have governing bodies, often elected, at least in part, and usually including parents. In principle, this seems similar to public schools. Independent school boards, however, each govern only a single school, which is a hugely significant difference. The schools stand alone. The schools are independent in many more ways than the obvious sense of that word, the way it's commonly used. Moreover, and also significantly, these boards represent a well-defined, usually relatively small, and thus directly knowable group of parents and school supporters, which often constitute a community of sorts, ready to become involved, ready to be engaged, ready to support, ready to contribute, anxious often to contribute. Consequently, governance, leadership, management, instruction, and interaction, social interactions, professional interactions of all kinds in independent schools are naturally more connected and more responsive. Now, in contrast, public schools are embedded within these large, complex, multi-layered bureaucratic systems that are, fasten your seatbelt, that are too big, too inflexible, too unresponsive, too opaque, too inbred, too distant, too rich, too unaccountable, too deeply integrated with and dependent on other interlocking bureaucracies, just too much in all important respects for them to be as naturally nimble and responsible as independent schools are. So think supertankers that need a kilometer or 5 to turn or stop. Think fleets of supertankers. Continuing with this image, public schools can be thought of as somewhat akin to armadas of various sized ships, or maybe even pleasure cruisers, all steering along the same course under the command of an officer corps. Independent schools are more like flotillas of single ships, making their own way across the ocean of learning. Now, a key consequence of all these differences for our discussion today is that independent schools are able to organize, operate, change, and adapt independently, whereas public schools must necessarily organize, operate, change, and adapt within their bureaucratically administered frame of both local board authorized and provincially proclaimed rules. Moreover, in Ontario, more so in some other jurisdictions, each public school is also subject to many more provincial level regulations than our independent schools, particularly with regard to teachers, hiring them, deploying them, using them, and curriculum, choosing what to teach and how to teach it, what to emphasize, what frameworks in which to develop fundamental ideas that must be covered. We should not be surprised then to learn that the independent schools in this study were able to respond and adapt to the COVID restrictions nimbly, comprehensively, and well, to the general satisfaction of all involved. Now, the question you asked me to talk on, and which I've been trying to do so, becomes not so much what policy levers need to be pulled to make all schools more nimble, responsibility, and community-based, but how might we enable public schools to be more nimble, responsive, and community-based. But we should also reflect on the importance of not overly restricting the functional independence of independent schools. Now, one obvious way forward will be to eliminate school boards in their current form, but this is not only unlikely, but impracticable. for a whole bunch of reasons we can unpack if you want, but I don't think we want to go there. Another way forward will be to make public schools more like independent schools, at least in some certain key respects. So we enable them, even to force them, to make more organizational, operational decisions for themselves in response to community and environmental circumstances. Another way, which will work best in combination with the previous way, will be to provide realistic support for independent schools or their parents, so that more parents could choose them, thus encouraging greater competition to better challenge the public school near monopoly. There are several more or less generic characteristics of independent schools, which I think enable those in this study to react as well as they did, and which we might wish to try and cultivate in public schools. But before outlining these, I think it's important to stress that in general, public schools do a good job. I'm not trashing public schools. They typically perform well under relatively stable conditions. But when there's a crisis, particularly an upset, an upheaval like we've faced over the last 18 months, the situation changes. And they were, to a large extent, a public school system, and therefore the public schools which depend on the system were paralyzed for a while. Furthermore, there are good social and economic policy reasons for having public schools. So I'm not aiming to criticize schools or urge their replacement in what follows, which won't take me very long. Nonetheless, so I believe there are several features that are typical of independent schools, largely explain how those in this Cardus study reacted so nimbly and well. These, by the way, are long-standing characteristics of schools as generic social systems that have existed and operated for centuries, long before public schools were invented. The thing to grasp here is that public schools are the new idea. Public schools are the new design. Independent schools typically conform much more closely to the traditional form of schools. So here are some of the features. First of all, freedom. To educators as the school founders, members, clients, supporters believe best. This includes freedom in small operational matters and freedom in respecting broad values and beliefs, always providing that they do not violate accepted standards in our free and democratic society. The school should be free to organize, operate, teach, evaluate, and supervise in ways considered best and appropriate for its declared mission. Now, we can't do that for all public schools, but we can nudge them along. We can provide opportunities for them to move down that path. We can at least talk about what those opportunities may look like. Number two, a declared commitment to education with a capital E, either in an informed general sense within a recognized paradigm or in a broad ideological form. Now, typically, this will embody a whole child, whole school approach in an independent school, which aims at developing abilities, talents, and character, as well as just subject competence. Subject competence is not going to be forsaken. It's not going to be neglected. It's going to have and should have in all good schools a high emphasis. But good schools, and I think independent schools in particular, take a much broader approach to the understanding education, social as well as instructional commitment and involvement. Now, I think this is a key point that maybe has not been widely recognized as a result of our experience across the board in these restrictions. The social contributions that schools make to the life and growth and mental health of students is much more important and much deeper than many people have previously recognized. That's really important. And I think generally, independent schools tend to be more open and embracing of the social dimensions of education, as well as the subject and character dimensions.
Oh, very good.
Autonomy. You want me to finish? Autonomy, accountability, dedication and commitment, and opening the door to sensible innovation. End.
Very good. Thank you, Derek. Bunch of questions that come in on the Q&A. We're almost out of time here, so we're going to jump straight into the Q&A. Amanda, I'm going to start with you. There's a question two questions targeted to you. First one is that you mentioned the possible permanence of incorporating technology into learning. It's written here as the benefits of such educational technology are at best arguable. How will schools approach such a move critically rather than simply rolling over in the face of technological marketing? And then in tandem with that, as you think of your response, another question directed at you as well, Amanda, was, can you provide an example or expand upon your statement around less permanent investment?
Sure, I can start with that one easily, even in terms of, I think, the spaces that we occupy in terms of permanence. Many schools then finding ways to move outside, to get into the community, to find, just because they couldn't come into the space, didn't mean that they didn't have other options. And I know that was a source of real frustration for many schools when independent schools were just lumped into this, mass of like all schools, and not being considered for reopening here in Ontario more recently, because many schools had already made many accommodations where they could be outside their space. And so even in terms of like furniture and things like that, I think we've realized we have to be, there is no set, this is our goal, this is the end of what we need to achieve. Our school is, a school if we have all the desks in rows and, all of the furnitures and parts and pieces that we would assume. I really think that that our minds have been opened to there being other options. In terms of the technology, I think I want to make clear, or maybe I should ask for clarity in terms of the question, if you can repeat it again, or I want to make sure that I have it, of just, are we talking about just using technology in general, or technological, like any like digital programs? If I could.
Good question. The downside of not having our audience right in front of us.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a question on the permanence of incorporating technology into learning.
Oh, okay. Well, I think that as well. I think that realizing that there are a lot more questions that need to be asked, and a lot more considerations, a lot more investment, research, all of it, that there really are a lot of limits to the technologies. And we need to keep expanding on those, understanding what those challenges are, and to have clear goals in mind of what are the goals in terms of the technologies. I see in my personal experience, is that it's effective when you have other human beings involved. So you cannot just, and that was really important. And in terms of the communities too, something that I saw anecdotally was like the stronger and the closer the communities, and the more supports available, the more effective these online spaces were. And they could emulate more of this, where I talk about the virtual classroom, and not just, having information sent, along these digital lines, and then having the students, send something back, but really more in line with a classroom, with a natural classroom. And that was really important. So being able to see face-to-face, small groups online, the breakout rooms, all of that, we learned a lot about what worked and what didn't. I could talk for days just on that topic alone.
Speaking of talking for days, we're technically out of time. Would you mind if we keep going? Could we go to the end of the hour? Deanie, Derek, Amanda, can I? All right, thank you. Just let's keep going through some of these questions while you guys are here. So in terms of, here we go. So internet access, so both Deanie and Amanda, were there issues in terms of family, students within your school communities lacking internet access, or having trouble with connections? I know some of my colleagues, they got multiple kids on taking up bandwidth while they're trying to do their work from home. Were those issues, and if those issues did exist, how did you deal with those?
There definitely were issues. The vast majority of the schools that were participated in this study are rural, have a rural location. So just by the nature had difficulty. But I think the point is the adaptability, the nimbleness. There were all sorts of interesting ways of distributing curriculum. Some schools chose to only do one subject digitally, and all of the rest would be delivered in packages to the school or picked up, and they would do that on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. So again, the responsiveness, used technology as they could, but otherwise they got together and used physical distribution of resources and had asynchronous learning and didn't depend as much on synchronous learning.
Yeah, something that we talked a lot with the schools. We had ongoing conversations all summer long, all spring, all summer, all until they continue and on they go. And something that is really consistent messaging that comes up time and time again, it's the importance of the communication with our communities. And that has to be constant. So early on with some of these challenges, in order to overcome that, we would have discussions with our parent communities, with our teachers. That was really critical. So even in terms of how what we were communicating and the discussions that we were having, that was all part of the problem solving. And so understanding what are the needs of our communities and what are the challenges that they're facing. I know some schools, modified their schedules, and like Deanie was saying, finding all sorts of creative ways, but having that input, that direct input from those that are, impacted, and then being able to respond to that was, very important, and but then possible, and again with small, depending on the size of the school. But I think that communication piece and incorporating all the stakeholders was important.
Right. So another question here talks about going back to the presentation you gave, Deanie, regarding double the recommended instruction time. So what was considered to be instruction time?
So the study does break it down a little further. Some of it was how the principal filling it out would perceive the definitions to be, but there is a figure in here that talked about the frequency of synchronous learning, and you can see the chart there. The interesting finding for me was that in the upper elementary, they had the most synchronous learning. At the high school level, they had fewer hours, in some cases even fewer hours of synchronous learning than students in grade, oh, I'm losing it, but it's, oh, sorry, here it is, in the younger grades. So even in grade 4 to 6. So that was kind of interesting to see the use of synchronous learning was part of that, but that didn't encompass all of the instructional time. I'd like to pick up on something Derek said as well, in terms of the wholeness of the education that was offered. And I didn't refer to it in my presentation, but the study does take a look at it. It wasn't just literacy and numeracy that the subjects that the public schools were really being encouraged to focus on, but schools offered like a well-rounded education. They continued on with social studies, with science, 82% of the schools, Bible instruction, 85%, music and arts, over half of the schools, even phys ed, 2 out of 5 schools carried on with that. So French carried on, other courses. So there was this, like, again, trying to attend to the whole student, maybe not every day, but once a week, or just bringing in. So a real focus on subject competence, but obviously not at the cost of connection.
Just to pick up upon what Deanie was saying there, with regard to the future of schools and the legacy of our experiences over the last 18 months or so, I think it's quite likely that the kind of blended learning we'll see in the future, I think we are going to see a great deal of blended learning in schools in the future. But I think it could be quite different in secondary and elementary schools. Secondary schools just lend themselves, with the credit system organization, to much more direct and much more heavily invested online instruction.
Okay, so another question here, this one, I think I'll target it to you, Derek. What if we allowed any schools, including public and Catholic schools, to choose to get out from under their local school board and affiliate directly with the Ministry of Education, maybe a pseudo board, if you will? so that the benefits of nimbleness and focus on the student and then the focus on student needs could be more widespread to benefit all. So that's the first part of the question. Second question from the same person is, how can we embrace and encourage innovative and courageous leadership at the local school level, providing greater options and genetic diversity to allow the sector of education to thrive in the presence of such a lumbering monolithic bureaucracy?
Yeah, well, there are two aspects there, I think, which are important. One is removing the burden of bureaucracy over schools. And that was the first part of the question. And I think there's no really straightforward and clear way to do that, because the broad social and economic benefits that we get from bureaucratized organization and the way in which it becomes such a permanent feature, it has become such a permanent feature in modern life, it's pretty powerful. Don't forget, Weber talked about the iron cage of bureaucracy. You get sucked into it because of its efficiency benefits, and then you're locked in, and it's very hard to get out. And that's the kind of situation we see in the public school systems all over the continent. The question is, how do we liberate schools? I think that's what the first part of the question derives down to. And I guess maybe bit by bit, if we can do it. The major limitation, I suspect, is going to be a broad lack of leadership, courage, and expertise. There's probably not enough good leadership to go around, and it's going to be even harder to recruit good leaders when they have to try and lead on a very public cancel culture stage. That's going to be a difficulty in the future. Second part of the question was?
Second part, how do we embrace and encourage innovative and courageous leadership? Which I think
through leadership, I think that's the way you do it. Now, one of the problems in Ontario, and this is a particularly Ontario problem, is the inbred nature of the leadership cadre, of the leadership corps. You cannot rise to a position of high authority in Ontario unless you're thoroughly socialized and domesticated into the established system. So it's very difficult to bring in people that can free up the system, can begin to break down some of the walls and barriers and stimulate more leadership when you can't bring in people from outside that have a different view, that have different experiences, that can see a different way forward. Let's say we wanted to bring in somebody that was an expert in school-based budgeting from Alberta and put them in charge. Well, we couldn't do it because they have to have the Ontario paper qualifications.
Right.
Nobody in Alberta is going to waste their time gaining those qualifications when there are more important things they can do. So this is part of what I meant about the interlocking bureaucracy. So it constraints not just upon what schools can do and how principals can proceed in schools, but also on the surrounding regulatory frameworks. One of the most influential of which, of course, are the collective agreements with the teacher unions.
Yeah. Another question for you, Amanda. One of our guests here says, we found that parents were much more tired in the last lockdown, these last few months. As a result, even though we used more technology and had teachers supporting parents even more than last year, we struggled to teach as much as last year. Can you speak to this phenomenon?
That was my experience as well. Absolutely. And shared. And I think that was, it was just, I mean, we're running a marathon here now where we were sprinting at the beginning and had all of this go energy. And there was that adrenaline, like we're just losing steam now. So absolutely. Some of the conversations, I mean, I can just speak too broadly in terms of how we were, conversations amongst all the principals and school leaders, really refocusing our priorities, making sure we had our priorities straight: student health and safety, mental and emotional health. And with that, you could achieve more of the academics and continue with your programming. And so being flexible, I think with some of the curriculum, especially in the elementary, that's much easier to do. And so, really slowing down and focusing on how do we keep kids engaged, take off some of the pressure, and really focus on what we're there for, and leading and teaching in a pandemic. Our goals have to change somewhat, but still we're there to serve our communities, and so just whatever those needs are, how we're going to serve them, we just have to change that. But very much we had the same experience.
Derek?
Just a quick point on that. One of the things that is easy to overlook is that remote learning systems are easily gamed by students that wish to do that. So if you have willing and committed students, then remote learning can work well. There's no substitute for in-class teaching, of course. But if you have students that are not committed and not involved, and parents that are not committed and not involved either, then it's very easy to game the system. It's very easy to sign in the morning, go and do what you want to do for the rest of the day.
Okay, and a question that's
relevant to the question. I'm sorry, I forgot to make the connection here. The longer it goes on, the more opportunity potential gamers have to decide to game the system and to choose to do so. And of course, the more difficult it comes for teachers to be able to work with the kids to prevent that. Because in the absence of direct, immediate, socially reinforced feedback of the kind that you get in the classroom, it's impossible to guide and steer a classroom of students.
So perhaps related to that, another question directed at you, Derek, is regarding the whole child approach. And could you comment on what is lacking in the public school system related to the whole child approach?
Yes, I could talk at some length on this, but I've talked to...
The short version, we're almost out of time.
I've talked for too long already. The basic problem is a bureaucratic one again. It's breaking learning down into small bite-like pieces that can be standardized and delivered in that way. And in doing that, the focus becomes upon numeracy and literacy, upon the basic subject competence. And the other aspects that are important for the nurturing of the broader child just fall by the wayside.
Thank you. So one last question, then we'll wrap it up. This one's for you, Deanie. In terms of expenses, so what were the greatest expenses incurred during the pandemic at the surveyed schools? What was it, new technology or something else?
I'm afraid that wasn't one of the questions. So maybe Amanda can just tell us from experience.
I think combined, depending on the school, right? Everyone had different needs, but a combination for sure of technology needs, I think, for both students, to support students and staff. And then for all of the safety measures to implement into schools. So, just looking at everything from the masks and thermometers and stickers on the floor, and upgrading ventilation. There were many expenses there, and depending on the schools, setting up outdoor spaces. I mean, on and on it goes, depending on how they went. But
And another question I should have asked earlier: is there any government data that we can compare this to at all? Deanie, is there anything else that's been made available, or is this completely unique?
We haven't found a directly comparable study. I'm certain that bits and pieces of what we have collected, that the data do exist, but there is no comparable study that we found.
Okay, and for all of our audience, the study will be released very shortly. Hasn't been released just yet. I'll email it to all of the attendees. I have your email addresses, so I'll email it to you as soon as it's released, so you'll get it shortly. Thank you, Deanie. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Derek, for taking the time for this. This was a wonderful discussion. We recorded it. We'll make it available on YouTube in a few days. Thank you all, and have a wonderful afternoon, and enjoy your well-deserved summer holidays.